Alright, so I just kind of want to share something interesting that I did. I used Addictive Drums 2 to actually get the drums to sound as realistic as possible. That is to say, the way the background noise from the kit sounds is actually pretty faithful from mic to mic. So the snare drum actually has background noise that sounds like the background noise from an actual mic'd snare drum, and the same applies to every instrument that I wanted to have mic'd. So I built up these stems here, and we'll just listen to the drums the way they are, and then I'll go over exactly what I did. You get the idea, right? Just drums. But then if we actually zoom in on these waveforms, we'll see that they look very much like they were recorded. Like if somebody looked at these stems, they'd be like, oh yeah, of course this snare drum was recorded. I mean, like look, you can see background noise. But we'll go over to the actual tracks here, not the buses, and then we'll go through these because they're actually quite interesting. I'll show you what they sound like, and then I'll show you how I did it. So you can hear the background noise, and what's interesting about it is I went through Addictive Drums. I had multiple instances of Addictive Drums all built up, and what's interesting is I actually tweaked the proportions of each instrument in the background noise, like each other element of the drum kit. I balanced the proportions so that the actual microphones, the close mics of all of the instruments, would actually pick up the background noise the way they would pick the background noise up in a real live drum mic scenario. So, for instance, the snare drum, the hi-hat is overrepresented in the background noise, so that like the close left hi-hat is really overrepresented, and the far right china is very underrepresented, and the toms are a little bit louder, and the kick drum is a little bit low passed, because the top mic for the snare has a tendency to I'll also pick up the kick drum, but actually not a whole lot from the high end because of the surface of the snare. It actually has a tendency to pick up more of the low end. So I actually EQ'd the kick drum in the background noise of the top snare track to represent that, and I did the inverse for the bottom track. The actual bottom track has the kick drum slightly high passed instead of low passed. There actually isn't a lot of high end in that kick at all. I guess I could go back and fix that, but it's pretty convincing, all things considered. The rack toms, I'll get a part that actually has toms in it. The rack toms are the least convincing one, I have to admit, because it's very difficult to have rack toms actually sound real, because the way the head responds on the actual drum is just something you can't simulate very well yet. But if you actually build up an entire kit with background noise in every single track the way I did it, that actually goes a pretty long way in actually alleviating some of the weirdness that you get from using samples. So like here's some of the background track from the first rack tom. I mean, that's not too bad. Like, if you weren't paying attention and somebody just started playing these stems for you, you might actually make a mistake and say, oh, wow, I didn't know that those weren't actually mic'd drums. Right there, it's very noticeable that the timbre of every note is, like, exactly the same. So, like, I mean, like, you can't have it all, but you can definitely get close. Yeah, like anytime you have notes in rapid succession like that, it becomes very obvious that they're just samples. So in the floor tom, the ride is actually louder because oftentimes the drummer will have the ride cymbal, and as a drummer myself, I can attest to this. They have the ride cymbal sometimes halfway over the kick drum and then halfway over the floor tom, or maybe 20% over the floor tom, but it's very close nonetheless. So when you hit the ride cymbal, it's going to be very loud in the floor tom. So I've actually done that here. You can hear that the hi-hat is actually not as loud as the ride in the floor tom because I balanced everything. Where's the hi-hat? Oh, I guess there might not be a hi-hat right here. I know there's one part that has a hi-hat right next to the floor tom. So yeah, you can hear that the hi-hat sounds very distant in this mic. And then, I think it's like the last chorus here. Maybe this one, yeah. You can hear that the ride cymbal, as opposed to the hi-hat, is actually quite a bit louder. And now I'll just, because this is probably pretty boring at this point, I'm just going to take one of these apart and just show you exactly what I did. And it'll look a little goofy for a second. Like, what would be a good track? Like, let's just use the snare drum. Let's use snare top. And I'll unfreeze this track. Reaper has this really cool feature called freezing, where you can actually render a track but keep the original track, and it just hides the original track. And you can keep the rendered track to save on CPU when you're doing a session. And it's actually really good when you're recording and mixing at the same time. Like if you're doing your own stuff, it's oftentimes the case that you're kind of doing a little bit of mixing and tweaking and adding latency and adding CPU burden while you're tracking. And while you're doing recording, like you'll do some tweaks, add a few plugins, and then you're like, okay, that sounds okay. And then maybe you'll pick up the guitar and play a little bit of that part, and you're like, okay, that sounds all right. And then you'll throw some DSPs on that to make it sit well so you get an idea, and blah, 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 blah. Reaper's got this really cool feature that lets you actually just freeze the tracks so that they're not a CPU burden while you're doing other things. And you can actually freeze an entire folder into one single track and then mute all of the tracks so that you can save on CPU power. It's actually really fucking cool. Okay, so here's the snare track. The snare track has MIDI events for every single instrument, and it's being fed into two instances of Addictive Drums. So one instance has everything muted except for the snare, and I only have the close mics. I only have the close mic up, and the overheads in the room are very, very low. You don't have to do it this way. You don't have to do it with two instances of Addictive Drums, but I screwed up, so then I ended up having to use it this way. I ended up having to do it this way to save time. Because what I ended up doing was, I started with the kick drum. I was going to build up a drum kit. So what I ended up doing was I picked my kick drum the way I wanted it, and then I copied Addictive Drums over, and then I picked the kick out, and then I copied Addictive Drums over to the next track, and then I picked my sample for the snare. And it wasn't until I got to the overheads that I had an actual complete picture of the drum kit, right? So instead of going back and fixing and adding all of the drums again or whatever, what I ended up doing was just using two instances of Addictive Drums and deciding to mute all of the tracks that weren't supposed to be close mics. So if we open up this one, only the one only the close mic on the actual instrument of interest is unmuted on the first instance, and it's mostly just the close mic that's actually represented. And with the other one, it's actually the close mic that is muted and brought completely down in level and taken completely out of the room and is taken completely out of the overheads, and everything else has been left behind. So I have the kick drum up pretty high, I have the hi-hat up pretty high, the cymbals are down maybe about 15-20% lower. The rack toms are actually as high as the kick drum, but the kick drum has some processing on it, I believe. I didn't actually EQ it. I was remembering what I did completely wrong because I'm an idiot. But that's okay. It doesn't really need it. I mean, like, I could go ahead and do like a little tiny scoop in the highs, like just to kind of sell the illusion of actually being on top of a snare head. Like, that probably wouldn't be an issue. And so the hi-hat's pretty loud, all things considered, in terms of the level, and all of these are actually kind of, like the hi-hat is being high-passed in order to get some of the sheen out of it, so it actually sounds more distant. Because when things get distant, the high end actually rolls off. That's one of the little tricks that you can learn in order to make things sound like they're getting more distant, is that you can low pass them. And actually, the more low pass something sounds, as long as you're not completely removing the high end, it just has to be rolled off or slightly attenuated, you can actually make things sound more distant. And if you have reverb on top of that, it just makes it even more convincing to have things more distant, or in order to sell the illusion of things being more distant. Toms, I don't think I did any processing for the toms. All I did was just the room level and the I brought the room level and the overhead level down for the toms to make them sound closer. So the actual reverb of the room, the actual sound of the room, is down lower for the rack toms, or the rack tom and the floor tom, in order to sell the illusion that they're far away, or in order to sell the illusion rather that they are actually close. Sorry, I misspoke just there. I wanted to sell the illusion that they're close, so that means more close mic, less room mic, and the things that are further away from the snare drum, more room mic, less close mic. And I actually I took a little bit of the attack out of the rack toms, because if you actually listen to rack toms in whatever drum stems you want to listen to, oftentimes the rack toms do not sound as crisp in the attack as they do on the close mics anywhere else on the kit. Especially the room mics. If you listen to toms on a room mic, they sound almost compressed in a way, like to the point where the attack is like almost completely gone and it's just a boom, right? So I took the attack out a little bit. I suppose I also could have achieved this by doing some heavy compression, but that would have distorted the signal. So I thought it would probably be best just to roll off the attack in order to sell that illusion. I think maybe I did the same thing with the kick. Yeah, I rolled off the attack of the kick. That way the kick isn't spiking really hard. Yeah, there's just a lot of really cool little tricks that you can do to get the kit to sound the way it's supposed to sound. So this one muted. I accidentally had more than one track open. Thought it sounded a little weird. Let's do the second last chorus. It's got a lot of stuff going on. Or the very last chorus, I should say. That sounds pretty cool. You got to admit, I mean, like, in isolation, when it's soloed, not fooling anybody, right? But it's convincing enough that it actually adds a lot. And you might be thinking to yourself, Nick, why are you going through so much trouble to reintroduce information to the signal that we generally want to get rid of? Now, my answer to that would be, you only really want to get rid of that information if it's intrusive, right? Addictive Drums, doing it this way allows you to actually custom tailor the background noise of every single individual instrument. So a lot of the things that make the background noise intrusive on a lot of tracks can actually be mitigated, if not improved. For example, sometimes it's the case that the overheads and the room are out of phase with each other in a way that is also out of phase with the close mic for the snare and the close mics for the kick drum. So you flip the phase on the overheads, maybe you lose the body from the snare, but you gain punch in the kick drum. And you're like, oh, damn, there really isn't a way to fix that. And say you flip the phase on, or you flip the polarity on the room mics, and you lose body in the kick, but you gain a lot of body in the snare. And it's situations like this where you really just have no recourse, and you're like, damn, that really sucks that I didn't record in proper phase coherence with one another. Yeah, that's why that shit's important, and a lot of people don't realize how important that is, because it's very, very difficult to actually fix that once it's recorded. Because flipping the polarity of one element as opposed to another in a single signal is... I'm actually not sure how you would do that. I mean, I've been doing audio for 12 years, and I'm just now thinking, I don't know how you would do that. I'm not sure if you could do that. I'm sure there's a tool out there somewhere, but it probably costs $500. But in Addictive Drums, what you can actually do is flip the polarity of every single instrument, including the rooms, individually, right? So you can actually build up your kit while keeping everything in positive polarity, while keeping everything in phase coherent. You don't get a lot of the intrusive nonsense, is what I'm saying. It's for example, when you're dealing with a snare drum, it's oftentimes that the hi-hat will be very, very loud and intrusive. And damn, yeah, you're right. You want to get rid of that. So why am I putting it in here? Well, I didn't put it in here. The hi-hat, I was able to control the level. So it's actually down to the point where it's not intrusive, but it's represented, right? And it's that representation in every mic that adds to the overall weight of the kit and makes the kit sound bigger. Now, I haven't mixed these yet, so we don't know how big this kit can sound, but it's all of that background noise, the cumulative effect of all of that background noise that actually makes the kit sound big. And if you want an example of this, go onto CMT, grab any stems you want that have a real live drum kit with room mics, turn the room mics off and see what happens. Yeah, the kit sounds thin, it sounds really weak. Like, when I was first starting out, like 10 years ago, I didn't like room mics because I didn't like the phase coherence issues that they could introduce. But then I learned how to actually mic live drums properly and use a goddamn tape measure, and I learned my wave theory sufficiently to be able to mic a kit properly. And then it wasn't such a big deal, and I was like, oh man, room mics, I don't think I could ever record another kit without room mics. Like, room mics are the shit. Like, I love them. They make the kit sound so much bigger. But I custom tailored each one of these so that all of the intrusive nonsense that you typically run into isn't there, right? And if you really think about it, room mics are standard, and you would never argue against room mics, but room mics are not a close mic for anything at all. Really, the room mic is just a track specifically, like, dedicated for background noise. It's a background noise track. So keeping that in mind, I don't see a pretty coherent argument against the way I'm doing it here, as long as everything is in positive polarity and phase coherent, as well as the elements of each mic in the background noise being non-intrusive to the signal. All those things in mind, all those things together, I don't see a coherent argument against what I'm doing, because I probably won't have to use multiband gating or expanding or any weird stuff like that in order to get these to sound right, because I've already custom tailor them to sound convincing but right, if that makes sense. So I have all of the MIDI events here for the entire kit, and the only one that the primary one is the snare, and then the secondary ones are everything but the snare, and they're all balanced to sound the way a close mic on a snare drum sounds, long story short. So let's bring up the level of the background noise just to see what happens. Probably not an accurate representation because I render the track in mono, so I should actually just do this. I should actually just reduce the width to 0 so that you can hear just the solo track, because I noticed that the kick drum in the room mic was doing a little bit of stereo wobbling that I didn't like. There we go. So I had it around -20, -15 between there. Now, I don't care who you are. No drummer ever sounds that tight. But if you're not really paying attention to how perfect the meter is and how the timbre of every note is like fucking identical, hey man, it's pretty cool. You got to admit. So I'll just undo until I get to where I did not render, or yeah, where I froze the track. Okay. So let's just listen to the entire kit, and then I'll wrap it up, because this is actually way longer than I was hoping it would be. So in context with everything, and I did a little tiny bit of just tweaking on everything, so we can listen to the way it sounds with a little bit of processing, just to get an idea. These two are so different. Okay, so we can listen to the last chorus with everything included. What? I forgot I was doing some recording, and there's some garbage in there that I don't want. The guitars are a little fucking loud, I have to admit. Here, I'll bring them down a little bit. Something's not right with the toms here. It's almost like I have a fast attack on those compressors. Maybe that needs to be opened a little bit more. That's weird. To me, having dealt with so many recordings of live drums, the only element of this kit that actually would throw me off and lead me to believe that it was like triggered is really just the toms, and that's just something about sampled toms just never sounds convincing, depending on how the toms are done. Like rapid fire, like 16th notes at like 180 BPM just never sounds right with sampled toms. Never sounds right, and there's nothing you can do to get it to sound right. Other than really wobbling the velocity of the notes. That's one way that you can kind of get it to sound right, is that the velocity of the first strike be louder than the velocity of the second strike in your roll, because the left hand almost never hits as hard as the right hand, and being a drummer, I can attest to this, is that if you look at the waveforms of your own rolls, if you're a drummer, you'll see that the hits for the left hand, if you're right-handed, are almost never as loud as the hits for the right hand. So you can actually kind of play with that. And the same is true of your feet. So when you're actually doing the, maybe I can actually show you on any one of these. When you're actually doing up the MIDI events, what you do with the MIDI events is that you stagger the velocity. And I wonder if I have it on here that I can show you. I just have to highlight the last chorus because there's a double kick part. Where's that double kick part? Oh, I know there's the double kick part right here. Yeah, so like when I did the double kick right here, high velocity, low, higher, low, and then the beginning of the next, so here's like 1/4 note, right? Yeah, that's like 1/4 note, 2nd quarter note, and all of the 8th notes that are in there, or the 16th notes rather, all of the 16th notes are kind of staggered and they're lower, so it'll give rhythm. You know, it'll be ba-da-da-da, 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 ba-da-da-da. So it has rhythm in that way because the velocity of every single quarter note, the downbeat of every quarter note is actually louder, but they're still staggered in the sense that the left foot is never actually as powerful as the right foot, and it actually kind of gives the illusion that the drummer is actually playing, right? Like, you got to think about these things when you're triggering drums. You have to think about like the ergonomics of the drummer, like the way the drummer is likely to actually play. You know, it's like when you're doing like you know, like the Lamb of God stuff, where every single snare drum hit has like 4 fucking kick drums leading up to it, like, you know, when you're doing stuff like that, you got to think, how are his feet actually moving? I know Chris Adler's a beast, but hey, his left foot's probably not as powerful as his right foot. So, you know, you got to keep those things in mind when you're actually triggering your drums. But you know, that's enough. I think I covered enough that somebody would probably find something useful in this video. So I'm going to cut it off.